Today is Canada Day, and while most Canadians are lighting fireworks and celebrating 159 years of Confederation, something else is quietly happening that could determine the economic future of this country for the next 16 years. Right now, trade officials from Canada, the United States, and Mexico are sitting down together for the most consequential trade meeting North America has seen in this decade. The fate of CUSMA, the agreement that protects nearly 90% of Canadian exports from American tariffs, is officially on the table. And the man who negotiated it, the man who spent years calling it a colossal victory and one of the greatest trade deals ever signed, is now saying publicly that he wants it dead. Let that land for a second. Donald Trump, the same president who stood in front of cameras and told the world that CUSMA was a triumph of American negotiating power, is now calling that same deal something he'd rather see terminated. And he said it days before the review meeting that he knew was coming. He knew Canada would be watching. He knew markets would be watching. He said it anyway. And this is where the story gets interesting, because Mark Carney heard every word of it, walked into a press conference, and gave an answer that stopped the entire room cold. Before we break down what Carney actually said, it's worth understanding exactly what's at stake today. Because a lot of people hear the words CUSMA review and assume this is just another political process, the kind of thing that governments do on a schedule while the real world carries on without noticing. That is not what today is. CUSMA came into force on July 1st, 2020. The agreement baked in a mandatory review on its 6th anniversary, which is today, and gave the three countries exactly two paths forward from this point. Path 1, all three countries agreed to extend the deal for another 16 years, locking in the current framework until 2042 and giving businesses and workers the kind of long-term certainty that lets them actually plan for the future. Path 2, no extension is agreed, which doesn't kill the deal immediately but triggers something potentially much worse, a fresh round of annual reviews with no fixed endpoint, no guaranteed outcome, and the kind of prolonged uncertainty that makes investors nervous, chills business investment, and hands the United States ongoing leverage to keep extracting concessions year after year indefinitely. Canada and Mexico both want Path 1. The United States, under this administration, has made it crystal clear it wants Path 2 at minimum and possibly something far more disruptive than either option currently on the table. So this isn't a procedural meeting. It's a negotiation under enormous pressure on the most politically charged date on the Canadian calendar, with a counterpart who has been publicly signaling contempt for the deal he's supposed to be reviewing. Now here's what Trump actually said. In the days leading up to today, the president sat down with reporters and delivered one of the most internally contradictory statements he's made about Canada in years. He said he is not a big fan of CUSMA. He said he signed it primarily to get out of NAFTA, which he had always hated. He said he would rather leave it unsigned. He said he would rather have it terminated. And then, in the very same breath, he confirmed that talks are ongoing and said he would see what happens. Three completely opposing positions. No clear policy, no coherent strategy. Just a series of escalating statements aimed at creating maximum uncertainty in the days before the most important trade deadline in Canadian politics. But here's the thing, Trump's own remarks don't survive contact with. The deal he's calling a failure is the deal he campaigned on as a success. During his first term, Trump didn't just sign CUSMA, he celebrated it. He called it a colossal victory. He called it a truly extraordinary agreement. He pointed to it as proof that he was a better negotiator than anyone who had come before him. He held it up as a rebuke to NAFTA, the deal he spent years calling the worst trade deal America had ever made. And now, standing on the other side of the same agreement, he wants people to believe that this deal he personally negotiated, personally celebrated, and personally promoted as a win for America is somehow a problem that needs to be fixed or scrapped entirely. You cannot hold both of those positions at the same time. You either negotiated a great deal or you didn't. Trump has spent years claiming he did. This week he's claiming he didn't. And the only thing that changed between those two versions of events is that Canada refused to capitulate to his demands. That brings us to Mark Carney. Because when reporters pressed him on Trump's latest comments, on the ambassador's claim that the two sides were nowhere close to a deal, and on what Canada's strategy actually was heading into today's meeting, Carney said something that is worth hearing in full. He didn't deflect, he didn't minimize, he didn't play the game of pretending Trump's threats weren't real. He stood there and said this: "What I have seen with the president is that you're not close to making a deal, and then you make a deal. And then he added the line that should be on the wall of every Canadian trade negotiator's office. We could sign a bad deal this afternoon. We could have signed a bad deal a year ago. We're not going to sign a bad deal, so it has to be a real deal. Read that again, because that's not a political talking point. That's a strategic position. Carney is telling Trump, telling the markets, and telling Canadians simultaneously that this government understands exactly what it's doing. It has done the work. It knows what it wants. And it is not going to be rushed, pressured, or threatened into signing something that doesn't actually serve Canada's long-term interests. That is not the language of a government that's scared. That's the language of a government that has decided, deliberately and openly, that the only deal worth signing is a real one. And there's something else in that statement that gets missed if you read it too quickly. Carney isn't just being defiant. He's describing a pattern of behavior he's observed directly in his dealings with Trump. He's saying that the gap between where negotiations appear to be in public and where they actually end up can close very suddenly when the conditions are right. He's seen it happen. He's not ruling out a deal. He's ruling out a bad one. There is a difference, and it's an important difference, because it means Canada is not walking into today's meeting looking to blow things up. It's walking in with a clear position, a clear floor, and a clear understanding that the pressure Trump is applying is as much theater as it is policy. Now, why would Trump be threatening to kill a deal that most American businesses, most American farmers, and most American governors actively want to keep? The agricultural lobby has been on Capitol Hill for months, arguing that CUSMA renewal is critical to their industries. Business coalitions representing hundreds of thousands of American jobs tied to cross-border trade have formally urged Congress to support renewal. Republican senators from border states, from farming states, from manufacturing states have all heard from constituents who depend on the North American trading relationship that CUSMA protects. So if the political and economic consensus inside the United States is that this deal should be renewed, why is the president standing in front of cameras suggesting he'd rather see it die? The answer, according to analysts who've been watching this closely, is leverage. The threat of termination is not the same as termination. Trump knows he cannot simply rip up CUSMA on July 1st. The agreement requires 6 months written notice before any country can formally withdraw. That means even if Trump walked into the Oval Office today and signed a withdrawal letter, CUSMA would remain in effect well into 2027. He doesn't have the immediate power to blow the deal up. What he does have is the ability to create fear, to signal instability, and to hope that the fear of what might happen is enough to push Canada into making concessions it otherwise wouldn't make. This is the negotiating tactic, and Carney has named it publicly for exactly what it is. Think about the broader picture here. Canada and Mexico walked into today knowing they share a common interest. Both countries want renewal. Both countries are dealing with American tariff pressure. And both countries have been quietly coordinating their positions ahead of this meeting in a way that gives neither one an incentive to break from the trilateral framework and try to cut a separate bilateral deal with Washington. That alignment matters, because one of the things Trump has consistently tried to do in trade negotiations is separate allies from each other, deal with them individually, and extract more from each one than he could from a unified bloc. Canada and Mexico staying on the same page removes one of his primary tools. There's also a domestic dimension to today that goes beyond trade, because Canada Day is not an ordinary day to be talking about the future of Canadian sovereignty and Canadian economic independence. Carney has spent the better part of the last year framing the relationship with the United States in exactly these terms. He's talked about a rupture in the old order. He's talked about the era where Canada could simply rely on Washington as a predictable partner being over. He's pushed Canada to sign new trade deals, new defense partnerships, new energy agreements with countries outside North America. And today, on the national holiday, with a trade deadline forcing the question, all of that framing crystallizes into a single concrete moment. Either Canada walks away from this meeting with the beginning of a real deal, or it walks away with its position intact and the knowledge that it didn't blink. One thing that deserves more attention is what Carney's government has actually delivered in the lead up to this meeting, because there's a tendency in political analysis to focus entirely on the rhetoric and miss the substance underneath it. In the months before today, Canada formalized its request to renew CUSMA for 16 years. Canada's chief negotiator and top trade officials have been in active daily contact with their American counterparts. Canada has advanced 20 new economic and security partnerships across 5 continents, exactly the kind of diversification that changes Canada's negotiating position by demonstrating that Ottawa has real alternatives if Washington isn't willing to play fair. And Carney himself has been in direct communication with Trump, discussing not just trade but NATO, Arctic security, the situation in the Middle East, a level of engagement that tells you something about where Canada now sits on Washington's priority list, regardless of what the public rhetoric suggests. This is what makes Carney's approach genuinely different from what previous governments tried. Earlier administrations operated on the assumption that staying close to Washington, keeping the tone warm, and avoiding confrontation was the safest way to protect Canadian interests. What Carney has done is build the alternative options first and then engage from strength. He signed defense contracts with Australia, explored submarine bids from South Korea and European partners, pushed Canada past NATO's 2% spending target, and built a coalition of middle power relationships that gives Canada room to maneuver in a way it simply didn't have before. That context doesn't show up in a single press conference clip, but it is the infrastructure underneath everything Carney said this week. So where does today actually leave things? The most likely outcome of the July 1st meeting, based on everything analysts and negotiators have said publicly, is not a signed extension. The United States is not ready to agree to a 16-year renewal with no changes, and Canada is not going to accept changes that aren't in its long-term interest just to hit a deadline. What today is instead is a checkpoint, a moment for the three parties to put their positions formally on the table, identify where there's genuine common ground, and set the framework for the harder negotiations that come next. The real deadline, according to those watching most closely, is somewhere before the U.S. midterm elections, when the Trump administration will want a political win it can take to voters. That's the window. That's when a deal, if there is one, becomes most likely. And that means Carney's patience is itself a strategy. Every week that passes without Canada blinking is a week the clock ticks toward an American political moment where Trump needs a headline more than Canada needs a concession. Carney knows this. His negotiators know this. And the fact that Canada is walking into today's meeting on Canada Day, calm and prepared, with a clear floor and no intention of being rushed, suggests the government believes it's playing a longer game than the one Trump is trying to force. There's one more piece of this that rarely gets discussed, and it's the question of what a bad deal would actually cost Canada. Because there's a version of this story where the pressure becomes too great, where the business community gets loud enough about uncertainty, where the political opposition points to every quarter of slow growth as evidence that the government needs to just sign something and move on. Carney has explicitly rejected that version. But it's worth understanding why, because the reasoning goes deeper than stubbornness or political positioning. Canada's former chief trade negotiator Steve Verheuel, who personally sat across the table from American negotiators during the original CUSMA renegotiation in Trump's first term, said this week that he doesn't think anything close to a good deal for Canada has been put on the table yet. He questioned the value of the kind of agreements other countries have cut with Trump, arguing that deals negotiated under this kind of pressure tend not to stand the test of time. They get revisited. They get renegotiated from a weaker position. They create the appearance of resolution while leaving the underlying leverage imbalance completely intact. If Canada signs something today or next month just to end the uncertainty, and that something requires real concessions on dairy, on auto content, on digital trade, on any of the areas where the United States is pushing hardest, Canada doesn't get 16 years of peace. It gets a temporary pause before the next round of demands arrives. That's the calculation Carney is making. The short-term cost of uncertainty is real. Businesses are holding back investments. Some sectors are genuinely hurting. The economic data from the past year shows the strain. But the long-term cost of a deal that locks in American leverage for the next 16 years on American terms is potentially far greater. And Carney, who spent his career thinking about long-cycle economic decisions, is betting that the patience required to wait for a real deal is worth more than the relief of signing a premature one. Here's the question worth sitting with as today unfolds. Trump has now called CUSMA a failure despite negotiating it himself. He's threatened to terminate a deal that protects hundreds of thousands of American jobs. He's done all of this days before the review meeting in what every analyst watching has described as a negotiating tactic rather than serious policy. And Carney's response has been not to escalate, not to panic, and not to capitulate, but to sit down at the table today and say the same thing he's been saying for a year. It has to be a real deal. Do you think Canada's patience is the right call here? Or is there a risk that the longer this drags on, the more damage the uncertainty does to Canadian workers and businesses who can't wait for the perfect deal while the clock keeps ticking? Let us know in the comments. This is exactly the kind of question where your perspective matters, because the next few months are going to determine what Canada's economy looks like for the next generation. If you found today's breakdown valuable, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the follow-up as this story develops. Like this video if you want more coverage of the CUSMA negotiations, share it with anyone who's been following the Canada-US relationship, and drop your take below. Happy Canada Day, and we'll see you in the next one.